Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Speck. I'm a city planner working with downtown Wichita and the Sasaki team on your new downtown master plan that's in the works. This talk is called Towards a More Walkable Wichita. If you know anything about me, you know perhaps from my books that I've written, Walkable City Rules, some others. But in order to tell you a little bit more about my background, I am a city planner who's been working for about 30 years on all the different types of projects that city planners do. These include new towns like Rosemary Beach, Florida. They include interventions within existing cities, like the Monon Boulevard in Carmel, Indiana. They include a lot of street network plans where we look at both the distribution of traffic and then individual streets themselves, um, like Project 180 in Oklahoma City, which I'm going to be showing you more of moving forward. Um, my role in this project is to basically drop as much advice as I can and then stand back while the Sasaki team does their magic. But it was exciting for me to come to Wichita for the first time and get to know your city. Um, March 4th was the date appropriate for a talk on walkability. And I want to show you this. This is my final slide. In other words, I have 404 images, but I hope to be done within an hour. I like to keep the pictures moving. Hopefully, this will be as exciting for you as it is for me. Um, Wichita has a lot going for it. It is a beautiful setting. It has, as I discovered as we traveled around, gorgeous suburbs. It's clear there's a lot of energy, a fair amount of wealth, and good momentum. The downtown, which has many virtues, including some pretty great buildings, um, does not, however, feel as alive as I would expect, given how vibrant your economy and social life is in the city overall. And one of the purposes of plans of this nature is to give you all a downtown that is truly worthy of who you are as a city. You've certainly gotten a lot done in the last decade or decades. Wonderful collection of accomplishments at downtown Wichita and other things in the works. Currently, this is our study area, which is essentially the heart of the city and its downtown. We're looking a little beyond as well, but mostly focusing within these lines. This is presented a little bit to be funny, but I just want to make it clear that views expressed by Jeff Speck are not necessarily the views of the Downtown Wichita, Sasaki, or the Downtown Action Plan team. Conclusions have been reached absent from exposure to or interface with local constituent groups and are presented simply for consideration as the team pursues its planning effort. In my book, Walkable City, I essentially talk about why it's so important to make our cities walkable and particularly our downtowns walkable. And I talk about how to make them walkable. The why talk you are not going to get today, essentially because our time is limited. And that is available for you as a very quick 15-minute TED Talk, a version of this. I find more recently, since I gave this talk more than 10 years ago, cities need to hear this less and less. Most cities want to be more walkable, and that is not something they need convincing of. However, how to do it is something that most cities still are on the learning curve on, and that's where I hope to help. In Walkable City, I have what's called the general theory of walkability. It asks the question, how do you get people to walk? Particularly in America, where driving is so easy and so cheap, it's heavily subsidized. The car is sitting there in the driveway for most people. It's sitting there in the driveway between you and everything. And it's just so easy to fall into it. And so we want to create walkers by choice. And in order to do that, the walk needs to be as good as the drive. That's the fundamental understanding. That means it needs to do four things simultaneously. The walk needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. So we're going to walk through no pun intended, each of those categories. And that is essentially the structure of my talk today. So the useful walk is a story I heard from my mentors, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who founded the New Urbanism movement. Andres used to give this talk called The Story of Planning, and he commented on how, back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners who weren't yet called planners said, hey, let's separate the housing from the factories. And when they did, lifespans increased automatically, like immediately, excuse me, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And the planners were hailed as heroes. And Andres would joke that they've been trying to relive that experience ever since. So the onset of Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use, we now know this was wrong. Planners are not taught this anymore. These large blobs that make it impossible to walk from one activity to another make the useful walk impossible. And even though we know it's wrong, the fact is, typically when I arrive in a town to do work and land on a site, there's already a map like this one on the site that has to be undone. So there's been a lot of zoning that actually gets in the way of making walkable places. More walkable places, of course, look like this. This is technically the most walkable place in America in terms of what percentage of people are walking. Midtown Manhattan. You can see rather than blobs, it's confetti, very fine grain of uses. And this map is actually misleading because this red color you see towards the bottom center is vertically mixed use in itself. So uses are mixed and even within buildings. That's what a walkable place looks like. This is where I now turn to the fundamentalist, I should say fundamental, new urbanist argument around making communities. And most of this talk, almost all this talk is going to be about existing places and specifically Wichita. But we want to talk a little bit about making new places because actually the equivalent of cities are built in the US every day. But they're not built as cities, they're built as pods. But there are fundamentally only two tested ways to build community. And one is the traditional neighborhood, as you see here, and the other is suburban sprawl. Now, there are 1,000 ways to make a city, but there's only two ways that we've tested by the thousands, and they're these two models. The traditional neighborhood is defined as being diverse, compact, and walkable. You can see in this one image, bigger houses, smaller houses, places to live, places to work, like factories, places to shop, the main streets right here, places to recreate, schools. Most of your daily needs are within walking distance. That's the diversity that a proper neighborhood provides. You're actually looking at several neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are compact. They tend to be across cultures and time about a 5-minute walk from edge to center, so about a half a mile across. And then there's lots of streets. And because there's lots of streets, no one street needs to be all that big. And that's the key thing that makes it walkable. Sprawl, in contrast, clearly not compact, thus the name, sprawl. Clearly not diverse. A whole square mile might hold just one use. And what you're seeing here is a giant blob, a giant pod of only housing, sometimes just the same house, repeated over and over again. And it's not walkable because look, there's lots of streets, right? But most of them don't go anywhere. They're loops and cul-de-sacs. Those few streets that do connect, therefore, have to handle all the traffic of the whole metropolis, and they're pretty far apart. You can see there's not a single address on these streets. They're collector roads and arterials, and the houses turn their backs on them because they're noxious. In fact, they're designed entirely around a single criterion, which is moving as many cars as quickly as possible. We call them traffic sewers. So that adds up to an environment that is not walkable. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, the places where you only work, places where you only shop. Schools get bigger and bigger. People consolidate schools, which is great, I suppose, until you realize that the bigger your school is, the further away from you it's likely to be. And the size of the parking lot compared to the size of the school tells you all you need to know about these new suburban schools. Even our playing fields are supersized. And here in Weston, Florida, kind of the Everglades extension of Fort Lauderdale, they're very proud of their 8 soccer fields and their 8 baseball diamonds, but a kid living in this house actually has a mile-and-a-half drive to get to the play field, which seems preposterous. Like, how do we let this happen? But if you begin with the presumption that everyone's driving everywhere and the car is the means of transportation, then stuff like this just becomes a natural choice that planners make. So this is the part of sprawl that everyone forgot to count. If you're going to separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, and this is not Photoshop, this is LA, your highway system becomes a commuting system, and you essentially are relying on it to get everywhere, and therefore it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I always tell people, the single family house sitting all alone with nothing but other single family houses around it is a option. For many, it's the American dream. But if that's your dream, then this will be your nightmare because the isolation implies the need to be stuck in traffic between the different land uses. The amount that we invest in our horizontal infrastructure so that you never have to wait more than one single signal at a light robs our civic purse from investments in other things that might be more rewarding. The experience of being in these places can be very frustrating. It's hard on families. The longer your commute, the more likely you are to be divorced. That's a fact. And I got this image from an epidemiologist who co-wrote the book Urban Sprawl and Public Health, in which he and his colleagues said basically the reason why we have the first generation of Americans expected to live shorter lives than their parents is because we have engineered out of existence the useful walk in our communities. So the idea that you drive to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk is why we have a unhealthy society. So, driving can be a real drag, walking can be worse. And these are the two models. So when it comes to the creation of new places, these two models are your choice. It's important to notice that the sprawl model on the left and the neighborhood model on the right contain the exact same stuff, right? Places to live, places to work, places to shop, schools, parks, institutional buildings. But the question is, how big are they? How far apart are they? And then do you have a nice network of small streets and blocks, or do you have what's called a dendritic or branching system of collector roads and arterials, where every road essentially hits the one collector? The great irony of sprawl is that it was designed around cars, but it actually works worse for cars because if you have one engine fire on your collector road, your whole city shuts down for an afternoon. Meanwhile, there's 21 different ways to get from this lower corner to this upper corner in this image. It's much more versatile. It can also molt, and that's why we've seen, villages become towns, become cities with this street network pattern. Once you build this dendritic branching pattern, you're basically stuck. You're not going to see much growth because the traffic is maxed out in the collector road almost immediately. So those are the two models. So it's clear that when you want to build for a useful walk, you need to have the street network, you need to have the tightly mixed uses. What about our existing communities? Well, they were built on the right framework, as you see here in downtown Wichita. But we ask a different question, which is, if we want walking to be useful, how is your balance of uses? And what uses are missing or underrepresented? And in most American downtowns, the answer to that question is housing. We have this odd concept that only really landed heavily in the US of the CBD, the Central Business District, and the idea that people would not live downtown. But of course, that does not make for a useful downtown. When the housing comes back, when you get more housing in your downtown, as many cities have accomplished in the last 2 decades and are still working on, then everything else gets so much better. Everything else comes back with a fervor. Jane Jacobs in the early 60s, late 50s, talking about Wall Street, she said, "Why is there not a single great restaurant?" And it's changed since then, but why is there not one great restaurant or one great gym on Wall Street? And her answer was what she called time spread. She said, a great restaurant or a great gym needs to have an evening crowd as well as a morning crowd. And she also said, for that to accomplish, you can't rely on bringing people downtown. You have to put them there. This was the era when people were building highways in and out of our center cities with the idea that that would make the downtown more convenient. What it actually did was it made it very convenient to leave the downtown, only come back when you had to, and it robbed the downtown of residents and life. So she was one of many who advocated to stop robbing our inner cities of population and, in fact, to bring more people into the heart of cities. A lot of cities are investing in this. So in Des Moines, for example, they had about 2,500 units downtown in 2000. By 2020, they had about 10,000 units. They did it specifically by offering developers a 10-year tax abatement. For example, turning this building from vacant office into occupied residential did not cause the taxes to go up on it. And similarly, 10 more years subsequent to that of tax increment financing, the city essentially financing the improvements in anticipation of a later payback in higher tax returns. That's something that cities do when they wish to see their downtowns thrive, understanding that bringing the downtown back by putting more housing in the downtown is going to ultimately benefit their bottom line down the road. So you've had an addition of a bunch of housing in your downtown. You're not doing so badly. New housing on the left, 2,500 units currently in your downtown core. That's many, many less than you should have or could have. You're going in the right direction. What we see in Wichita and everywhere is that when you build apartments in the downtown, they are occupied. They can be condos, they can be apartments, but people want to live downtown. There's an incredible mismatch between people who want that urban, walkable lifestyle and people who are being offered space attainably in city centers. When you provide it, you can sell it, but the city sometimes needs to goose the market to make that happen. It's also great to see you've got 2,500 students coming downtown into the new biomedical campus that's being built. A lot of them will be, working and learning downtown. A lot of them are going to want to live downtown, and it's important. It's a real should be a real layup to provide attainable housing not too far from the biomedical campus that will allow people to have that 24-hour downtown experience. Second question in this category of the useful walk. What downtown is underpriced and overrepresented? And that is almost certainly parking. That is the case in most downtowns. The parking may not be exactly where you want it to be, or the wayfinding may not be getting you there conveniently, but certainly you have an oversupply of parking. This has been well documented and is best explained in a wonderful book by Donald Shoup called The High Cost of Free Parking. Donald Shoup, rest his soul, passed away recently, the dean of American parking. He really figured it out for American cities. He told the story of, we talk about the wrong thing when we talk about parking in cities. The principal thing we talk about is we ask the wrong question. How can we have enough parking? And that's not an instrumental question to ask. The proper question to ask is, how can we provide, design, and manage parking so that cities thrive? And if you ask that question, you get a very different answer from how can we have enough. The first rule is to eliminate the on-site parking requirement. Now, when someone wants to convert a disused piano shop into a cafe, for example, they will typically find that they have to triple the amount of parking that's provided on site. And guess what? It doesn't happen. And Donald Shoup talks about all the bad things that do happen when you require parking, but he talks more about all the good things that don't happen. So rule number one, I'll get into more in a minute, is eliminate the on-site parking requirement. Number two is price parking in line with its value, which we'll get to. And number three is to create parking benefit districts. So getting back to eliminating the on-site parking requirement, a lot of bad things happen because we have these arbitrary top-down, state-imposed requirements for the amount of parking that we have to provide. Shoup notes that removing off-street parking requirements will not eliminate off-street parking, but will instead stimulate an active commercial market for it. You just want people to make decisions rationally, and that means that parking should be provided and priced by the free market, and not have some, Soviet-style top-down regime that people have to provide, when in fact it often is nonsensical. There's been a tremendous trend in the US over the last decade of cities just simply eliminating, reducing, or simply eliminating their off-street or on-site parking requirements. Seattle, Cambridge, Culver City. This is just one little quote from the Parking Reform Network. Major cities that are eliminating their parking requirements. Certainly, you should do it downtown if you haven't already. And you can find more at PRN, the Parking Reform Network, which is listing, every month new cities that are doing what you should be doing in Wichita. And when you eliminate the rules, people adjust and they recognize, for example, in Seattle, that they had enough parking and new units are built without anywhere near as much parking attached because the developers are able to meet their markets and what their financiers demand as opposed to a random rule. Rule number two, park pricing in line with its value. Allow the free market to operate. Price parking, like in this very old, this is an update in '07, but this is one of the first ever downtown parking plans that price the most desirable parking at the highest cost, the next desirable at less, and then even less further away, with the city lots being free. So that we wanted the cars to go into the city lots, and then otherwise we wanted there to be available spaces on the main street. The parking meter was invented by merchants for merchants to create the churn at the curb that would cause them to have the most possible success. And in fact, it's often merchants that fight pricing parking properly, but merchants benefit when parking is priced properly because it allows Daddy Warbucks to find a spot near the furrier, right? The people who are willing to pay the most, who are willing to spend the most shopping, are also the ones who will pay a fair price for parking. So it should be priced based on the demand and then properly wayfinded so that you can find it when you need it. I think it's worth noting, though, the goal is one empty spot per block face at all times, about an 85% occupancy, as Shoup describes. The pricing should not be the same across your whole downtown. In fact, I would say on curbs that are not full, the parking should still be free. I suspect, or from the limited amount I've heard, that the discussion around parking in downtown Wichita, which is going through some transitions right now, may not have its eye on the ball. And its eye on the ball is one empty spot per block face all the time, or more if the demand's not there. If you don't have crowding, you should not have pricing. Eventually you will, and you should. Or if the pricing isn't enough and you have crowding, you may need to price it higher. But the point is that you should respond to the market and price parking in line with its value so that people can make the right decision about where to park. So my question is, do you need a price? And when do you need that price? And of course, it can vary around the clock, and it should. Number three, creating parking benefit districts. Because merchants fight charging the right price for parking, you need to give them something in the bargain. In old Pasadena, your meter money makes a difference. The idea of a parking benefits district is that every extra dollar earned by charging more for parking goes into the very neighborhood that it's charged in. It goes into better sidewalks, planting trees, even storefront improvement grants. In Pasadena, they turned the rear alleys into this wonderful pedestrian network. There are no dumpsters in Pasadena. Each block has a central trash compactor that serves the block because of all the extra money they raised from parking, and the merchants have truly benefited as a result. So those are Donald Shoup's three rules. Another question, what is valuable and being wasted in the downtown? And it's probably also parking. And here's where I bring up one other thing that you should pay attention to. This is Lowell, Massachusetts. They had all these old 19th century loft buildings that were disused. Developers wanted to turn them into housing, but the banks were requiring parking spaces, and the parking spaces were not available. Obviously, on these well-developed sites, the ratios were not there. And so the town, being very forward-thinking, acknowledged that they had 5 different parking structures scattered around the area that were only partially full during the day and mostly empty at night, and actually wrote letters to the developers that the developers could take to their banks and say, look, we are dedicating 200 spots in this parking lot for your building, etc. This can be done with public buildings as it was in Lowell. It can also be done with private parking if the city crafts a deal with private lot ownership. But the point is that if you have a lot of structures in your downtown, you can offer them to developers to meet their financiers' needs so that, as in Lowell, all of these old lofts are now occupied with lovely apartments. We did a plan for downtown West Palm Beach where we identified 4 lots that were well under capacity and also identified some of the missing teeth in the downtown and noticed that, the empty spaces in this lot would support this much new housing in terms of parking provision at the current rate. The empty spots in this lot would support this much new housing. The empty spots in this lot, et cetera. You end up with a downtown where almost all the missing teeth can be filled, um, taking advantage of the free parking essentially that's available. And by free, I mean, already built in surrounding areas. So you've got a lot of parking lots. I'm willing to bet most of them are half empty during the day and mostly empty at night. And this is money in the bank that you could be using to float new housing. I wanted to mention transit quickly. I understand you're moving your transit center across the river and also eliminating the shuttle. That concerns me. A lot of people who work downtown don't own cars. They need to get downtown. It strikes me as something that just needs some more attention. But the final category in this useful walk is, mixing uses, parking, and then transit. To have a truly walkable city, different walkable neighborhoods need to be connected by transit, or else everyone will own a car. And there's a lot of people who can't, who can't afford it, don't want to. But many of those are people who would be working downtown and they need a way to get there. Otherwise, they're going to have to buy a car and gum up your streets with their traffic. So that's the first category, the useful walk. The second category is the safe walk, and it's where we spend most of our time. It's where I'm going to spend most of my time today because it's the thing that cities can fix the fastest because cities own their streets, or most of them. Wichita is somewhat special compared to many of the places that we work in that you don't have the state owning a bunch of your downtown streets. You don't have the county owning a bunch of downtown streets. Most places we work, it's a struggle. We're working next week in Louisville, where the state controls half the downtown streets, which is tying our hands as to what we can accomplish. Wichita owns its streets, and so Wichita can decide what to do with them. And the principal thing Wichita can do to make its downtown more walkable is to make its streets safer. There is a pedestrian epidemic underway. There are 78% more pedestrian deaths each year in the US than there were 15 years ago. It's a real tragedy. It's a function of many factors discussed in this book, Right of Way by Angie Schmidt. And one of them, of course, less known but very, very influential, is what we call the suburbanization of poverty. We have this whole sprawl zone, right, that I described to you, where it was never anticipated that anyone would live without a car. And yet people do live there without cars. And it was not meant for walking around. And so you get circumstances like this one. But by far the biggest factor in the pedestrian death epidemic is the vehicle bloat that was encouraged by federal laws that has caused, most manufacturers to produce SUVs rather than sedans now. And of course, when an SUV hits you for a number of reasons, it is more likely to kill you. So what do we do? Clearly, we can advocate for smaller cars. That's a long-term discussion. But in the short term, what we can advocate for is slower speeds. I don't come into communities and say, let's slow the cars down. That sounds like I want traffic. What I say is, let's get people to drive the speed limit. Because if you post a 20 or 25 mile an hour speed limit in your downtown and it's engineered for that speed, then you will be a much safer place. A car going 35 miles per hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. So that threshold between 35 and 25 is so important. Every mile per hour counts. And of course, posting the speed does not matter. if the street is engineered for higher speeds. Now, Chuck Marone and many other engineers have informed us something that some of us learned on the job, which is that when you want to post a speed of 25 miles an hour in the US, they make you engineer the street for 30 or 35 miles an hour. It's this crazy idea that by creating elbow room, you're making the street safer, when in fact, what you're doing is encouraging speeding. There's a fundamental misunderstanding underlying much of the uh, traffic safety profession in the US, which is that elbow room creates safety when elbow room actually creates speed and danger. This is also discussed by a more recent book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer by Wes Marshall, that just came out last year, that tells the story about the misconstrued foundation of traffic safety in the US and how we should be following more of a European model, which is called Vision Zero. And what Vision Zero means, simply put, is you engineer the environment to encourage drivers to go the speed that you want them to go, right? So what does that mean? How do we get people to drive the speed limit? I'm going to run through about 10 things that we can do or we should look at in terms of determining whether people are driving safely or not. The first is block size. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. The typical street in Portland is a two-lane street. This is Salt Lake City, famously less walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. And the typical street in Salt Lake is 5 or 6 lanes across. You see one here. This is my family, part of my family, crossing a street in Salt Lake City where they give you flags to wave so you're not run down. I thought this was funny until I saw what they were doing in Vancouver, in Canada, on Granville Island. They have an even better program. It's called Grab a Brick. Be seen, look, wave, cross, establish eye contact. You're much less likely to be hit. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the Canadians are very nice people, and these are foam bricks. They're not real bricks, just FYI. Anyway, Salt Lake City on the right, Portland on the left. You see how different they are. This is a study of 24 different California cities. When you double the average block size, you roughly quadruple the number of non-highway fatal crashes. So smaller blocks are better. Let's look at your blocks. You're on the right. This is the heart of your downtown. Portland is on the left. You're about 250 by 400. That is a very nice block size. Going further west, you're about 250 square, even smaller across the river. So here's where we say, wow, you've got good bones. You have a foundation that allows you to be a walkable city. So let's start there. Now, there are other parts of your downtown where the 1960s came in and you super blocked. The idea back then was somehow by eliminating the block structure, the city would become more walkable. And perhaps areas within the super blocks are more walkable, but the city as a whole becomes much less walkable. And of course, these aren't even streets; these are just parking lots. So I wouldn't say this is a particularly walkable environment. But the one that really hits hard, that a number of people mentioned to us, is the area around the amphitheater. Sorry, it's called Century 2, if I remember correctly, Century 2. That is a super block right near downtown core. That is, the size of 3 or 4 blocks, or maybe 6 blocks, but also importantly, it walls the downtown off from the river. And what you hear from folks is that, wow, we have no real way of accessing our river down here, and it really kind of stinks that we're broken off from the water's edge. I wanted to mention there was this plan for the site a number of years ago that involved tearing down the Taliesin and Frank Lloyd Wright style Civic Hall, and was rejected for that reason because people are still in love with this admittedly lovely for its era piece of mid-century modern architecture. And I just want to make a point, which is that whether you decide to keep this building or remove this building, it is possible to institute a street network through the site, preserving the tall part of the Hyatt, preserving the parking deck, preserving this structure, and then having the rest of the site to remake. Now, a waterfront gets used when there's a street up against it. So it's important to have a street like this near the edge of the water and not too much between it and the water. So you can establish a network of green spaces in these locations. And then importantly, a corridor that brings you to the water in urbanism because we like to be in streets between buildings, as I'll talk about in the segment on the comfortable walk. We like to be in urbanism to reach the water's edge. And then you have other sites to fill in that ultimately create a piece of urbanism, a piece of city that's bringing you to the water's edge. You don't need to tear down the Death Star in order to accomplish this. Now, what's next? So that was size of blocks. Next is the number of lanes. Obviously, the more lanes there are to cross, the more danger you're exposed to, the more it looks like a highway, the faster cars are going. This is Oklahoma City. They were named the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. Yikes. The mayor called me in about a dozen years ago and said, what can we do? And I said, let's do a walkability study. And it was Mayor Cornett, who I recommend that you meet with. He's really great on this topic. He said, what's a walkability study? And I actually hadn't done one yet. And I said, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. We've since done about 15 or 20 walkability studies. This one, what we did was we looked at the car counts, and you can see them here on the screen, knowing that a two-lane road can easily handle 10,000 cars per day. And here are counts of 6,000, 4,000, 5,000. Yet these are streets that were sized as 4 to 6 lanes with these piddling car counts on them. And for example, this could have been a two-laner. So conveniently, fortuitously, Devon Energy was coming to build this new 51-story tower in the downtown core. The day that my report landed, they essentially realized they were going to have $200 million in tax increment from this new investment. And they said, what can we do with that money? And the answer was, let's rebuild building face to building face. Let's rebuild every street just about in our 40 block downtown core. It was my job to design the curb to curb of these streets. And I was able, based on the car counts, to remove a third of the driving lanes. I was able to double the amount of on-street parking, which the merchants loved, and add a bike network where there was no bike network. And so a typical street went from this to this. Here it is under construction. This 4-lane one-way became this 2-lane two-way with tram in it. This busiest street in the downtown became this. I always tell cities, this is what you do if you have money, is you can actually rebuild your streets as you right-size them. And by the way, if you don't have money, you can just restripe them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this was a rebuilding job with a wonderful budget for landscape. And if you go to Oklahoma City now, I mean, it's not the most walkable city you'll ever visit, but if you knew what it was like before, you'll be much impressed. So you have Douglas Avenue. It's the heart of your downtown. So much is happening on Douglas. It is truly your spine. It's truly where the downtown is already regenerating and will continue to regenerate if the right investments are made. And then, it's 5 lanes. Does it need to be 5 lanes? Let's look at the car counts. Then you've got Broadway. Broadway is 4 lanes. Does it need to be 4 lanes? Let's look at the car counts. So interestingly, Douglas Avenue has 14,000 cars per day. That suggests it needs to be more than 2 lanes. Does it need to be 5 lanes? I'll show you in a minute how it doesn't. Meanwhile, Broadway is 11,468 cars per day. Now, one of the rules we applied in Oklahoma City was if a street is experiencing less than 10,001 trips per day, it does not get left turn lanes at intersections. And that's important. However, 11,468 would get left turn lanes. And so here we have an opportunity to take this 4-laner and turn it into something else. And it's what we call the classic American road diet. 4-lane streets are actually something that we don't build anymore in the US because the fact is that a 4-lane street handles no more traffic than a 3-lane street. And that's a little surprising. Now, of course, 4-lane streets are dangerous. There's lots of opportunities to get hit as one car stops for you and another doesn't. But in the classic American road diet, those 2 fast lanes, which are also the turn lanes, which make them extremely inefficient, are replaced by a single turn lane in the middle. You gain 10 to 12 feet when that lane is removed. You can turn that into bike lanes. You can turn it into parking. You dramatically reduce the number of crashes and injuries. That's expected. But what everyone finds a surprise is this chart. And what you see here, I think it's 22 different 4 to 3 lane road diets, is the number of cars per day before, running from like 13 to 21,000 or so, and the number of cars after really doesn't change. The total, if you add up these two columns, it's even a little bit higher throughput at the end. What does that mean? It means there's no reason not to do it. You can get just as many cars through the street. Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, when a 4 laner became this street, biking went up 78%, walking went up 100%, crashes down 40%, retail sales up 9%. So win, win, win. So here, Broadway could easily be a 3 lane street and should be restriped to 3 lanes. Douglas, 5 lanes. It's clear with its 14,000 cars per day, it only needs to be 3 lanes. In fact, there was a proposal done, finished in 2020, and then COVID hit and people got cold feet. Probably, I heard some echoes that people got cold feet around turning that 5 lane road into a 3 lane road that maintains its parking, that has bus stops, that has loading zones, then has a buffer. We'll talk about this, a buffer between the parking and a protected bike lane, that all fits within the same street network. Now, whoever felt that this was going to cause more traffic, that's certainly or more congestion, that's certainly a natural reaction to the fear of reducing lanes. However, it was a reaction that was made blissfully unaware of the data. What the data makes very clear, look at these numbers. All of these streets, except for 1 or 2, have more traffic on them than Douglas does. And so you have a tremendous amount of leeway here that you can convert Douglas to a 3 lane street, and it still could experience a ton more cars per day and not become unduly congested. So I think the verdict is in on what you can do with Douglas. Look at these numbers. So I also want to mention your one-way streets. The next issue, and you're already attacking this question. But the next thing that makes streets dangerous is one-way travel. Here's Davenport, Iowa, where my wife is from. A picture I took from a railroad bridge that just reminds us that a one-way street with multiple lanes, don't worry about one-lane one-ways, but multi-lane one-ways operate like highways. You have the multiple lanes in each direction, which means you have the opportunity to jockey, which makes you a much more dangerous driver. And so in Louisville, Kentucky, for example, Brook, first, second, and third were all one-way streets. Louisville did this back in the 50s. They converted their entire downtown to one-way, just about. We're going back there next week to try and fix this. They've already started to fix it. When Brook and First were reverted to two-way and second and third were kept as one-way, on the two-ways, car crashes dropped by almost half, and crime even went down by almost a quarter. On the one-ways, crashes went up and crime went up. There's a clear problem with the safety of one-way streets. Now, I showed you the rebuilding of Oklahoma City, and I mentioned often it makes more sense not to rebuild, but to save money and to restripe. You can restripe a whole downtown for the price of just rebuilding a few streets. And that's what we do in most of our projects. And it's probably what you should be doing as a general measure in Wichita. This is a restriping project I want to show you. This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We went from this street network, you can see the 4 lane one-ways, to this street network, again, before and after. That allowed us to turn this parking network, where red is angle, into this parking network, which the merchants love, and to change this bike system into this bike system, just because of the extra space we were able to find in the streets as we eliminated all the multi-lane one-way streets. They didn't budget this at all. What they did was they locked in the plan, and then as the streets were repaved over time, over 8 years, they eventually instituted the new striping system. So this 4 lane one-way became this 2 lane two-way. This fellow over here is learning on day one how to not park in a bicycle lane, but you get the idea. So you have Water, Main, Broadway, and to sorry, Water, Main, Market, and Topeka, all one way, and all now. Oh, and first and second, first and second, first and second are here. First, second, Water, Main, Market, and Topeka. Those four are now being converted to two-way travel. By the way, it seems to be a thing in Wichita, one-way travel. My hotel entry is one-way travel. It's very frustrating. I don't know what this is, what's in your water, but I'm glad to see that you're reverting it. Great news. This is the before, this is the after, as it is currently today being restriped along with the other three north-south streets to into two-way travel. That's just great. But first and second are not. And you can see the interesting conversion, the swooping lanes here, highway style planning that is converting traffic uh, to this one-way condition on those two streets once they get east of the river, which they approach as two-lane two-ways or multi-lane two-ways. But then this switcheroo happens, and east of Wichita Street, they are one-way, solid 16 blocks until they get to the highway. And beyond, the the story I heard was, oh, we need to do this because of the highway ramps. Well, that's fine, but the highway ramps are 16 blocks to the east. So you can take that same configuration and move it to hydraulic or some other street, which has much less pedestrian demand than your downtown, and suddenly have 16 blocks of two-way travel. Will this cost money? Yes. Will this increase property values in a way that makes that money back quickly? Yes, because a multi-lane one-way really feels like a highway, and highways sunder real estate value, while multi-lane two-ways create real estate value. So this is the solution that was a bridge too far in the current plan, but we recommend that you reinstitute it. And remarkably, we'll talk about this in a minute, when you replace multi-lane one-ways that intersect with each other with two-lane two-ways, most of those signal heads, most of those signals at the intersections can go away. You don't need to have signals. You can just have all-way stop signs where those streets meet. We'll talk about that in a minute. Next, the width of the lanes. Andre Stuani used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical street to the typical subdivision is now wide enough to allow you to experience the curvature of the earth. And that is true because of this mission creep. See the donut in the foreground? Our streets have gotten wider and wider because the rules have required it. This is a subdivision from the 60s. This is one from the 80s. Same height of airplanes, same size of house. But look what happens to the roads as the roads have gotten wider and wider. When the roads get wider, when the lanes get wider, people drive faster. When people drive faster, there are more crashes and injuries. Thank goodness now there is NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, saying that 10 feet is an appropriate width for an urban street. It does not need to be wider. You see here these two SUV and truck are passing perfectly fine with a 10-foot lane. Of course, a little more elbow room would be just great, except it would cause you to speed. So 10 feet is the proper measure. So let's look at some of your streets. Main Street, well, it's 4 lanes across, so it should be 40 feet, but it's 49 feet across. Let's look at Douglas Street. 5 lanes across to the parking lanes. It should be 50 feet. Well, it's 62 feet. Let's look at Douglas Street west of the river. 5 lanes across, 67 feet. You have an extra 17 feet distributed between 5 lanes, making this a extraordinarily unsafe street. And the conditions that you see here is that the newer the streets are, and don't feel bad, this is kind of normal in America, the newer your streets are, the wider the lanes are, because more and more you had highway engineers making those decisions. So how about Waco Avenue? Well, 3 lanes across, 30 feet. Congratulations. But what you see here then is that your public works department or engineering department is satisfied with the 30-foot measurement. So we can have confidence then saying, let's put that on all the streets. And as you move forward, you should be striping to that 10-foot measure. Next, parallel parking or curb parking. It could be angled too. It's a barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. You definitely want that parking there wherever you can have it to make pedestrians feel safe. This is Fort Lauderdale. In happy hour in Fort Lauderdale, you can see that you're allowed to park on one side of the street, not the other side. Until my walkability study was complete, you could not park here at rush hour. Now you can, but when I took these pictures, this was happy hour on the parked side of the street. This is happy hour on the unparked side of the street. Because no one wants to sit or dine or stand or walk right up against a lane of traffic going 40 miles an hour. So we like the parking. The other part of this picture is the street trees. Street trees used to be called FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects. The engineers would say they add danger. In fact, the more recent studies show that your street is safer for drivers and pedestrians when you have street trees along it, because the street trees slow the cars down, right? Sometimes abruptly. But it's too bad this guy hit this tree. The data shows that there are fewer injuries and crashes when the trees are there, actually. But better to hit a tree than a pedestrian. And of course, a line of trees seen in perspective creates a wall that, if you don't have the parallel parking, does protect the pedestrian in a wonderful way. This is a Dutch artist's interpretation of, or Swedish, excuse me, interpretation of what a street feels like when you don't have the parallel parking, when you don't have the street trees. It's pretty accurate. Next, I mentioned signals and stop signs. We are generally over-signaled in the United States, and we know that because of what happens when you remove signals and how wonderful stop signs are compared to signals for creating safety. This was a study in Philadelphia from 1997, because in 1972, the rules changed and they had to pull out 472 signals in Philadelphia. And when they did that, collecting a ton of data, crashes dropped by a quarter, severe injury crashes by 63%, severe pedestrian injury crashes by more than two-thirds. Because an always stop sign is a intersection in which only the most flagrant scofflaw is going more than a low speed through it. Traffic engineers believe that the safety benefit stems from the elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red. Everyone speeds up to beat the red. But more importantly, when you have this always stop, you are never going fast unless you are severely breaking the law. Whereas a signal, half the people going through the signal are going quite fast. I call this the good city, with the wheelchair user comfortable and the cyclist going the wrong way comfortably. It's really an ideal intersection design. When we did our plan for Albuquerque, we recommended turning 17 downtown signals into stop signs based on having moderate travel in two directions in those intersections. They took us up on 11 of them, and then they bagged the signals. Sorry, bagged the stop signs. First, they bagged the signals. Then there was a rebellion. People hate change, so they bagged the stop signs. And then there was a rebellion even stronger in the other direction, because the drivers realized that the signals were causing more traffic than the stop signs. And that's the big surprise takeaway, is that it's faster to get through a downtown pausing at every intersection than it is to sit waiting for lights to change. And that's why ultimately it was drivers who demanded the stop signs come back in order to get through the downtown faster, in addition to it making the streets safer. So wherever you can introduce a stop sign in place of a signal, we recommend it. Here's a cute little fun fact. When you remove the center line from a street, speeds go down on average 7 miles per hour. Why? It's kind of weird, but it's the kind of counterintuitive discovery that explains so much about how we use our streets, which is that the yellow line makes us feel safe to speed, because we know if we stay on one side of it, we won't get hit. So you remove that yellow line, all of a sudden you have a much safer street. Next are all the details that kind of describe whether a place is an environment for automobiles or an environment for humans. This is truth in advertisement, or truth in the media. Some say the entrance to city center is not inviting to pedestrians. You think? So whenever you have streamform geometrics, swoops, aerodynamic shapes, right? It kind of communicates vehicular motion. What is the radius of curvature of your corner? Is the radius of this curve 1 or 2 feet, or is it 40 feet? Because this 40 feet radius, which is often imposed by fire departments, um, causes cars to speed around corners. And of course, when you're crossing a 20-foot street, you're actually crossing 40 feet because of the vast tarmac that sits between you and the other side of the street. Um, we size our intersections when we build new places to the template of the fire truck, but we do not accept arbitrary numbers like 40 feet, 30 feet. We make sure things fit. We have mountable curbs where we need them, but we don't oversize our intersections. And swoops like here on Water Street generally cause people to speed up, or here on Central Avenue, people like the G-force, they go faster around curves. You don't want to have them where you don't need to have them. And this is clearly a later 20th century addition that made a once walkable block network less safe. Then you look at Douglas. I just want to bring up that your engineers are applying highway engineering in a downtown street. So what's the difference? Look at this left turn lane. You're supposed to swoop right to go left because on a highway at high speeds, that is the safer way to do a left turn. But it is not the urban way to do a left turn. This is from my book, Walkable City Rules. We describe the urban versus the highway solutions to left lanes. And this is a proper urban left turn. It's in Albuquerque. And you can see the parking pops off the curb. The left turn lane introduces itself. Here's the two styles side by side. And the urban example is one that's encouraging urban speeds. Well, everything about the highway example is encouraging more dangerous speeds. So just a note that your highway department, or I should say your street design department, is using highway standards when they should be using urban standards. The next part of this segment, I think maybe the last part of this segment, is bike lanes. Biking, urban cycling is the biggest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. And what we found is that it is the bicycle investment that creates the bicycling culture. You need to create a fairly comprehensive network of low stress bike facilities, and then you change the culture. And that's what you see here in Pittsburgh, where the parked cars have been pulled off the curb 13 feet or so, and you have the buffer for the doors and then this protected bike lane. You see here in Prospect Park West in New York City, the bikes have been put against the curb, the cars have been pulled off the curb. A 3-lane street became a 2-lane street. Well, that must have wrecked the traffic, right? Wrong. So the number of cyclists tripled, sidewalk cycling went away, speeding went away roughly, and injury crashes dropped by almost 2/3. Yet the number of cars making it through the street ended up the same afterwards. Because before, people were just speeding from red light to red light, and it functions just perfectly well as a 2-lane street. This being New York City, of course, there was a drawn-out 6-year lawsuit, but eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. I show this picture, though, mostly to contrast this this girl to this girl, and the idea that nobody really wants their daughter in the door zone. We used to design door zone bike lanes. My Oklahoma City project has door zone bike lanes. We do not do it anymore. It's just too dangerous. The door opens and you are in traffic, getting run over. The bike lanes should not be exposed to traffic. And also, when you expose bike lanes to traffic, people just put things in them. They put trash cans in them and dumpsters in them. My Uber driver never pulls to the curb, even when there's 3 empty parking spaces. He's sitting there in the bike lane. We get buses in the buses in the bike lane, and deliveries in the bike lane, policemen in the bike lane, bikes in the bike lane. There's always something in the bike lane. And so it's another reason why the new standard in bike lanes is to protect them from traffic. Sharrows, the good old share the lane markings, we've learned now, actually, particularly when you put them in highways, do not make cycling any safer. It's actually been shown that you're not doing cyclists any favor by stamping these in streets. I learned this news. I remember I was in Melbourne that morning, and I learned this news, and I took to Twitter and I said, we need a new Sharrow symbol that's more accurate. And this was the runner-up proposal, but the winner was from Queen Anne Greenways in Canada, who who came up with the Prero. Please don't hit me in the bike lane. In any case, um, you have some bike lanes downtown. What you don't have is a comprehensive network. You also have them in the door zone. Principally, don't feel bad. That's kind of standard practice in U.S. cities until recently. This is the new standard to actually have some sort of curb protection against the bike lane, which can be depressed or it can be up on the sidewalk edge. This is in Somerville, Massachusetts. Most New England municipalities, at least around Boston, insist that when streets are rebuilt now, if they're major streets, the bike lane is placed up on the sidewalk edge, but with some sort of barrier, trees or something between the bike lane and the rest of the sidewalk. So there's clearly a biking zone, clearly a walking zone. So finally, we have in the US bike lanes of the quality that I experienced in Berlin in the 1990s. I mean, we're getting there. The point is that you have cyclists here, but you don't have many. And it's frustrating because you add bike facilities and the number of cyclists doesn't change until you've created that comprehensive network. And so, if you want to have a cycling culture, which we've learned draws talent, draws educated talent, draws youth, and is kind of a celebration of being a progressive and forward-looking community, until you have a comprehensive low-stress network, the culture does not change. But you have to be strong and resolute. And when you can get to most addresses in the downtown, I'm not talking about the whole city, but when you can get to most addresses in the downtown in a low stress bike network, you will see a major change in your biking population. Nationwide cycling population is principally a function not of climate, nor topography, but nor culture, but rather of cycling investment. So that ends the safe walk. We have two more categories, but they're much quicker. So we're getting near the end of the talk. The comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk is a little counterintuitive because, many of us like to climb mountains and see broad vistas, but actually we like to feel contained. The evolutionary biologists tell us that like all animals, we are simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. You want to see your predators before they can attack you, but you also want to feel that your flanks are covered from attack. And if your flanks don't feel comfortable, you don't enjoy being in a space. So a plaza is only as good as its walls, a street is only as good as its edges. We've been talking for many, many years, 30 or 40 years, about what's the proper ratio of height to width. 3 to 1 is great. 1 to 1 was the Renaissance ideal. Actually, it was written about in treatises in the Renaissance. Beyond 1 to 6, you don't really feel enclosed anymore. Trees of help, of course, but this is pushing the limit. So Salzburg at 6 to 1, delightful. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. This is Houston back in the 80s. This neighborhood's doing much better now, but I keep showing this slide to remind us that it's principally the surface parking lot that destroys that feeling of spatial definition as you walk down the street. And of course, you have conditions in your downtown where, the least comfortable spaces are those places where it's just wide open fields. And the more comfortable, the more accommodating spaces, have buildings that are tall enough to shape the edges of the street into outdoor living rooms. And it was no surprise to me to learn that your high school seniors, to take their graduation photos, or people who are taking wedding photos, go to the old town to take pictures on these streets, which it isn't just the bricks that are making them accommodating, it's the shape of the space. And of course, my new favorite space in Wichita was this one that I was brought to, this lovely alley, which is actually a 3 to 1. Makes me very much feeling protected and safe. And then you have corners that are just blown out because of missing teeth. And so that's an urban design discussion about, what are the most important places to put new buildings, which are these, here on the west side, these three missing teeth out of four around this intersection, which cause it to kind of, your spatial definition kind of bleeds out into the prairie. But here in Europe, the places we pay money to get on planes to visit understand that outdoor living rooms like this one in Madrid, which you can get into at every corner, but of course, are beautifully walled, or just any of these streets or any of these spaces. This plaza, when you're in it, you are really in it. Spatial definition is the technical term that we like to achieve to have comfort in spaces. Rotating buildings does not help. When you rotate a building at a corner like you guys have up here, it eats away at that spatial definition. You're no longer as well shaped in the space. And then, of course, the other big part of the comfort discussion is trees that, of course, provide local cooling, important, all the things that trees do. It's not just about comfort. I've already mentioned how trees make streets safer. Trees also absorb tremendous amounts of storm water. They absorb ozone, they absorb CO2. They do lower your heat islands dramatically. They improve test scores. They reduce crime. It's actually amazing all the things that trees do. They're the least they're the most underinvested thing that you find in most cities. And the best parts of your Main Street, Douglas, are where you have good tree cover, and that should be important to you as you move forward. And then finally, moving from the comfortable walk to the last category, the interesting walk. I talked about how one-to-one was the Renaissance ideal for a street space. This is a one-to-one space. It's in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids is quite a walkable downtown, but no one wants to walk on this street, which connects the two best hotels, because, when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a conference facility, apparently designed in admiration for the parking deck, it's just boring. It's too boring. These long horizontal stretches where nothing changes and this kind of faceless, unfriendly building. What we like to see is eyes on the street. Eyes on the street mean doors and windows. It also means signs of human involvement, variety, feeling that there were many human hands at work, and of course, hiding the parking decks. So here in Charleston, Mayor Riley, mayor for 40 years, taught us it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of parking. We now do that as a standard measure. This is the Chia Pet Garage in South Beach, near where I used to live. You can see these mid-century storefronts were retained as the parking deck went up behind. Um, I was looking in Wichita for your version of this. I found it. The faceless building against the boring parking lot. You have lots of exposed parking decks in your downtown. And where they've already been built, it's a struggle to articulate them or maybe put artwork on them in a way that makes them more interesting. That can certainly be done with murals and color. But then one good example, which could be better, but notice that the upstairs is set back behind this more habitable edge. And among your parking decks, this one across from the transit center is the most welcoming because of that thin liner. There should be a rule moving forward in your city. Many cities have this rule that you can't build a parking deck right up against the edge of the street unless its ground floor is dedicated to some other use, or it's set back behind some sort of liner that gives it a human edge to the street. So those are the four categories. Um, I said don't rebuild, restripe. I just want to point out one contradiction to that. Sometimes it makes sense to invest in reconstruction because of all the benefits that accrue from that investment. This is Lancaster, California. It was a 5-lane highway. It had a lot of cars on it, and no one was shopping. People were driving through, but not stopping. And they decided to give it new life by doing this to it. In 2011, my friends at Moulin Polyzoides designed this essentially linear parking plaza that is for parking most of the time, but occasionally for farmers markets and other things. This was built at a cost of $11.2 million. Injury crashes dropped by half, pedestrian crashes by more than three-quarters, pedestrian activity doubled, 57 new businesses opened, 800 new housing units landed, and 2,000 new jobs arrived for an economic impact of $282 million from that $11 million investment. So when looking at Douglas, perhaps it makes more sense to restripe. Excuse me, perhaps it makes more sense to rebuild than to restripe. So that leads me to 10 steps to a great downtown Wichita. My leave behind from today. Number one, remake Douglas, whether it's a restriping or a rebuilding. That is your heart. It has two more lanes than it will ever need. And the data make that clear. Second, don't stop now. with water main and the others, but two-way first and second, ideally all the way to the highway. Three, in other streets like Broadway, you have extra lanes. Do the math. If it's less than 10,000 cars per day, you only need two lanes. If it's four lanes, it should be three lanes. Four, wherever you can change signals to stop signs, always stop signs, you should. Five, any lane wider than 10 feet should be 10 feet. Six, try to complete your low stress comprehensive bike network in your downtown. Your whole city will not be bikeable. But if your downtown area is bikeable and you people living downtown, suddenly you have a truly biking city. Add housing near parking, as I discussed, that you have a lot of parking which is being underutilized, which can help float the construction of new housing in your downtown. Eight, plant trees. It can be expensive in an urban street, a hardscape, to create new tree pits, but your standard moving forward is whenever you build or rebuild a street, trees should be placed on that street continuously. That means about 30 feet on center for the length of the block on every block. Reach the river. We described a little bit. We discussed a little bit how that could be done more effectively through the Century 2 site. And that is the prime opportunity to do that. And then finally, start with the heart. I heard from Heather of downtown Wichita, Heather Schrader, that her philosophy that she had heard from other places was, start small and perfect. I had actually heard the exact same thing. Andres Duany once told me, he said, the way to make change in cities is to start small with something as perfect as you can make it. And then that attracts people and it moves out from there. In the 1990s, all we were hearing about as planners was Denver. People said you had to go to Denver. So we went to Denver. And what we found in Denver wasn't Denver, it was Lodo. It was the lower downtown. It was one section of Denver, and it was just like 3 blocks of Lodo, a very small area where a brewery had been built and the streets had been made safe and just a few new buildings. It was this little nugget of a city, a little piece of one neighborhood that had transformed the entire reputation of a city. That's how cities change. And so while it's tempting to sprinkle the walkability fairy dust everywhere throughout your city kind of lightly, no, you really need to pick your heart, focus on it, and make it perfect. And so that's why we're so excited about Douglas Street as the place to start, because it already has the good bones, it already has great buildings, it already has some great trees, and there's a lot going for it already. So we really believe that that's the place of investment that will lift the whole city, and particularly the whole downtown, the fastest. So those are my conclusions. I always like to end with some resources. There are the books for folks who need to be convinced or are not particularly active making change, making physical change in your city. Walkable City is the most useful and convincing, I would hope, book. Those of you who are doing the work, those of you who as city planners, as engineers, as activists are actually making change, Walkable City Rules has a lot more pictures, charts, graphs, details, and techniques that you can put to use. I mentioned the first TED Talk, Why Walkability. I have a second TED Talk, How Walkability, that's essentially a 15-minute version of this talk today. So if you have friends who don't want to watch for an hour, this is where I would send them. And then all these resources are available at our website, speckdempsey.com, where we would direct you to learn more about what we do, but also other resources that can help you out. Finally, I'm teaching a course at Harvard as I do every spring. This one is at the end of May. It welcomes folks from all over. You don't need to be admitted to Harvard to be admitted to this course. And when you're done, you get a piece of paper that makes it look like you graduated from Harvard. So it's a good deal, even though it's not cheap. I hope to see some of you in Boston this summer or next. I mean, this spring or next. We do it every year. Thank you. There's the slide I promised you. We are done. And I'm grateful for your attention. I hope this show is of use to you all in Wichita. And I will say goodbye. It's been nice talking to you.